Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Equals. This is Max.
Hi everyone, welcome to Equals. This is Naf.
Naf, back on the air with me again, and not Nabil. You must be disappointed.
Seriously, Max, I think you used some kind of juju to get me to do these interviews with you, like back to back.
Well, I'm not saying juju, but I was staying with Nabil recently in the US, and maybe I might have said a few things.
Okay, juju or charm, you can call it whatever. I can't pretend I'm not disappointed, but at least, Max, I get to do a really interesting interview with you this week.
Yeah, well, at least the topic's interesting, even if your co-host isn't.
Yes, so water. What do you think of when you think of climate and water, Max? What's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Well, in preparing for this interview, the thing on my mind this week has been the terrible floods in Kenya, with people seeing their houses swept away. And our colleague Anthony, who we work with all the time, his mum back in the village saw her house flooded for the first time ever. So clearly the
Mm.
flooding is getting worse, linked to climate change. But then he said something which was really interesting. He said, although there's so much water now, he's convinced within a couple of months the problem will be drought. So it's a sense in which there's enough water, it all comes at once in the wrong places, it's sweeping away people's houses, and then within a few weeks there's not enough. So yeah, that was what sprang into my mind.
A friend from Kenya was also telling me a similar story, and I've been thinking, inequality in water, because imagine the world is covered with water. Of course, fresh water sources are smaller. But don't you think there's enough water in the world for everybody? And don't you think, this would have been the least of our problems, ensuring access to water? Think of all the scarcity we're faced with under climate, for instance, Max, lithium for the transition. But ensuring access to water should be the least of our problems. But the inequality in distribution and access is a huge problem.
And that's what the interview is about this week, inequality in water. We interviewed the wonderful Sushmita Mandal. She's a senior research fellow for water, food, and ecosystems at Stockholm Environment Institute. They're the people we worked with on our climate equality report last year. And she joined us to talk about water and inequalities. Fabulous interview.
Sushmita is excellent, Max. Really looking forward to our interview.
Yeah, let's listen to it.
Sushmita, we're often exploring issues on inequality, for instance, wealth inequality, corporate monopoly, taxation, and so on. But let's go back to the basics and talk about fundamental inequalities like access to water. Given your extensive experience in Southeast Asia, could you shed light on the global water crisis? What are the primary factors contributing to this issue, and why are so many people still lacking access to clean water?
Thanks, Naf, for that question. And to talk about this, I think I'll start with a small story here. And the story is from India, where a few students from a premier engineering institute, the IIT Bombay, wanted to teach children in a informal settlement near their campus science. And during one such class, when they were teaching about gravity, they gave an example of how a drop of water falls to the ground, and that water always flows from top to the bottom, like the river joining the sea. And at that point, there was a student in the class who stood up to counter and said that that's not true. Water does not come down. Instead, maybe it goes up. And so the person who was teaching was a little puzzled at this response and was like, explain how come, why are you saying that? And to which this child went on to explain that he lives in this informal settlement, and every morning when his mother goes down to collect water from the community pipeline supply, there's never enough water, or water often comes as a thin trickle. But she goes to work at an apartment next door, which is a high rise. And she goes to the 14th floor and she opens the tap at any time of the day, and there's water gushing out. at that point, this boy then says that, you mentioned that water comes down, but here we are staying on the ground level and we don't have water, but the people on the 14th floor have water. And I think this, in some sense, sort of encapsulates the relationship of between water and people, and how water flows. Water flows where power and where the money is, in some sense.
Sushmita, that is an amazing story about the apartment blocks, and one I think Naf and I can really, our lived experience. When I was in Kenya, I can exactly all of the big houses. They have constant supply of water, and it is this sense in which money buys you clean water. So if you could talk a bit more about Southeast Asia, where you are, how does this play out in everyday life? In the life of a poor person, what does it mean to struggle for water each day?
As in most other places that you probably have also lived, in Southeast Asia too, it is the poor, the less privileged who are always struggling for water. While I, staying in an apartment, would never know where my water is coming from, for that matter, because there's 24/7 water there. But for a poor person, it's a daily struggle. It starts from morning, when one is looking at to find the right time to get there, so that I'm not the last in the queue on the community pipeline, or by the time my turn comes, the water is from the tanker is over. So those are the realities in which most people are working or are trying to access water. And while we talk about this, and when we look at this in the context of, say, rural Southeast Asia or rural Asia for that matter, one would imagine that, there are a lot more sources of water, be it duck wells, be it ponds, be it smaller lakes, rivers. But again, in that context, that water is probably not even clean enough for drinking and not even potable enough. And I'll reflect on an example from Laos, where I was visiting a couple of years ago, and visiting a ethnic minority community where they don't have access to clean drinking water. The only sources of drinking water in their context were these shallow dug wells that they would have, that they know where to dig up, so that so that they can access that water, and a little bit of rainwater that they could collect in various utensils that they had in their house. And it's such a stark contrast between how these people are trying to struggle on a daily basis to access water, as opposed to the big megapolises that some of us live in, where water is available, and that water is being made available to us at the cost of so many others who are not getting this water and who don't even have a voice to talk about their access to water issues.
Sushmita, just like access to health, just like access to food, or all these important, essential things in our lives, how does access to water perpetuate poverty and inequality? I mean, the Southeast Asia story that you told, I think you've already touched upon it. But I wanted you to go deeper into how does this perpetuate, poverty and inequality, because water inequality is not something new, but it must be, worsening the situation, no, like for communities living in poverty and so on.
So, to first start with, I think I'll again take you back to an example from parts of India, more from central and western India, where groundwater is sort of the lifeline of a lot of smallholder agriculture. And with the coming in of technologies that will harvest out water or can go deeper into the aquifer, into groundwater reserves to get water, what has happened is large farmers that who are rich, who have the access to the resources, are digging deeper into the ground and getting the water out. But what is happening as a result is it is impacting the shallower dug wells that might be there, that smallholder agriculturists might be using. And that's what is pushing a lot of smallholder farmers out of agriculture. Either they are migrating out of agriculture because agriculture is no longer viable when water is not available or water becomes expensive, or they are having to sell their land and become sharecroppers on the same piece of land and trying to eke out a living out of that. So that's how a differential access plays out even within the same group of what we may call as farmers, but there are richer farmers and poorer farmers, and this is how it is playing out. In a separate context, if I had to talk about how this is also impacting injustices, and when I say injustices, even the right to livelihood is not being able to have your right to livelihood is an injustice that is being perpetuated. And in this context, I'll talk about the big hydropower dam development that's happening on the Mekong River, for that matter. So on the Mekong, and especially, I mean, it's been a few years now, or more than a decade now, of dams, and more dams are coming up on the river. There are communities along the river who depend on the river for the fish, for different other resources. So one of such resources is a river weed called kaipen. Now, kaipen is like an algae, which is usually the women who collect it when the water levels are low. So this is the time of the year between February and May, when the water levels are at its lowest in the river, when the algae grows in the river, because the algae needs the sediment and the rocks and the light to fall into the river so that they are able to grow. So this is the time when when women go out into the river and harvest this algae, which is a source of livelihood for them. But ever since the dams have come up on the river upstream, what has happened is that there is a decline. The women have been talking about that there's a decline in this river weed that they used to harvest and sell in the markets. And when you ask them why is this decline happening, the two things they mention is, well, the river, there is no sediment in the lack of sediment in the river, or the nutrients in the river, because of which the kaipen is not able to grow. And the other point that they mention is, they don't ask us, or they don't tell us when they are going to release the water. So when you're generating hydropower, you have to release water, and sometimes this water is being released during the dry months when there should be no flows. But because you're generating hydropower, you need to constantly also be releasing water. And because of the fluctuating increased levels of water in the river, the kaipen is not able to grow. And that's a serious effect on the livelihoods of people along the Mekong in northeast Thailand as well as in Laos. So along both the sides of the river, people have, because the river basically is the boundary, the border between Thailand and Laos. And in both these countries where communities used to harvest this are complaining about how they have no access to this. And this is a source of livelihood that they are losing. It's also a source of their cultural identity in some sense, which they are losing. And those are important aspects which we often forget when we are talking about how this inequality is playing out in the lives of communities living along the river.
It's a very vivid picture, Sushmita. If I could take you back to the issue of kind of cost of water. I mean, in terms of proportion of their income, in when you talk about informal settlements, and it's often women, and there's clearly a big gender aspect here too, taking up an enormous amount of time to go and queue up and get water, and then also the cost of that water in proportion to their overall income, and how that compares with, say, a kind of middle class person in an apartment. What's the impact in terms of time poverty and the actual price of water? I mean, are they at least getting this water quite cheap, even though they have to wait for a long time? Is it also expensive as well? How does that work?
While we are talking about the cost, the pricing of water, and the pricing of water is considered cheap, right? Because it's easily, and the pricing of water in general is cheap. But when it comes to communities who are living at the margins, and when we have enshrined it in most constitutions that water is a human right, there should not be a price to that water. But today we have a price to that water. Can we then talk about differential pricing, where the communities who live in this informal settlements should be having access to this water free of cost, while the people who are living in big apartments or who have a certain higher standard of living should be paying more for that water. So, and like I referred to the first example of how that boy mentioned that water for me flows from bottom to top and not top to bottom, I think that's also referring to how the poor are actually subsidizing water for the rich. The rich are able to access this water because the poor have no access to that water. And I think that's the key element that we need to focus upon, that yes, there's so much time, so much of their efforts is going in just collecting that water, but it is at the cost of some other livelihood activities that they would have otherwise taken up and probably had a better life if they didn't have to spend so much time to access water.
So we know, Sushmita, that a warming planet and climate change is disrupting water supplies. I mean, that's well understood. But how is that change in the climate interacting with existing inequality in access to water to make it even worse? If you see what's the relationship between climate change, inequality, and water access?
For me, water is really the face of climate change. Everything that we understand of climate change for a layperson is through water. It's either an excess of water or the complete lack of water in some cases. And the fact is, the people who are at the margins when it comes to access to water, their access is only getting worse as we go along the line. If, for example, a woman is having to travel 5 kilometers a day to access the first point of fresh water in her village, she probably has to walk even further because the well has dried up. The issue of climate change and inequality as it is playing out currently is only going to make access to both quantity and quality more difficult as we go along the chain. And this is best illustrated through an example of how the changing flows in the Mekong is impacting the fish production in the Mekong. As you may know, 60 million people in Southeast Asia depend on freshwater fisheries, and the changing flows in the river is impacting what kind of fish is available, when is it available, and because of the dams, the fish is not able to migrate, and because it's not able to migrate, it is not able to breed and spawn the way it used to do earlier, as a result of which people's livelihoods that they depend on and the nutrition that they derive from fishery resources of the river is on the decline, and these impacts will only get worse with climate change, because at one hand there is infrastructure development that is ruining the river's flows, and at the same time you have climate change impacts which is affecting how much rainfall is occurring in the basin or in this region, and that will have impacts on how much water is available and what kind of water is available for the aquatic fauna to be there, and for communities to then access that for their food and livelihoods at the same time. So it's going to only get worse, and inequalities will only show up more in a more acutely as we go further with this, and if the business as usual continues, if we don't stop these from happening and don't take action on climate change.
That's my fear as well, Sushmita. That climate change is happening in addition to all the issues that you talked about. No, like as we said previously, like water inequality or access to water is not a new problem. It has existed for a long time, and we're still struggling to address those issues because who controls water? Who gets to access water and so on. And now the climate crisis is happening on top of that, and it will exacerbate those issues. No. And another thing I was thinking when you were giving an example, especially about the farmers, is, I used to think this problem only exists in the developing countries. But the situation in France, for instance, last year, there was a reservoir, no, created for farmers because of drought. They wanted to protect farmers, but a lot of environmental activists were protesting against this. Again, is water a common good? Who gets to access water and so on? So I also, I'm always worried. How is the climate crisis going to exacerbate this situation? Already existing inequalities, how are they going to be exacerbated? But that said, is there a future where everyone has access, to clean water, or where everyone has clean water? What policy changes can make water systems fairer? What hope do you have for this, Sushmita?
Now, as you have rightly pointed out, and as we see this rolling out in front of our eyes, the reality does look a lot grim. And but I would like to be still hopeful about how we can change things or what can be done. And I think the hope is in ensuring how we can make this resource accessible and available for everyone. We are currently to just reflect a little bit on the sustainable development goals, and there was a specific goal for water, SDG 6. We are definitely way off the targets in meeting SDG 6 goals. I think one hope that I seem to derive is from last year's UN Water Conference. So the climate people have had conferences, the biodiversity people have had conferences, but water conference, this was the second water conference ever that UN hosted in 2023, and it brought together a lot of different actors to talk about the importance of water. I mean, water is a connector. It's a connector of ecosystems, it's a connector of people, it's a connector across countries. And there's no way we can talk of life without water. And it is in this context that we often tend to think that there is water is an infinite resource. It is not. It is a finite resource, and that's why I think one important takeaway for me is to we have to move away from a supply side focus on water. It's like whoever wants water, it is always rationalized that we'll make that available, and that whoever is always the rich and the powerful and the private and the corporates that want this water. It's never in the realm of the poor, the marginalized, the farmers, the fishers, who also need that water. And we're not talking about how do we bring them into this context. And I think I want to also reflect here from the South Asian, Southeast Asian context, where water management and water governance has been extremely technocentric. So while water is a common social good, it's been always addressed by engineers more often than not. And it's almost like our rivers and our lakes are plumbing systems that we want to ensure that provides for our needs without ever wondering that it's an ecosystem by itself, and there is life which is more than human as well out there, and we're not talking about that at all. So we have to move away from supply side interventions to talk about demand side management. And when I say demand side management, it is about who is getting this water, who is getting this water at the cost of who losing out that access. And are we talking about those points when we are making these linkages clearer? And in this context, it's also important to talk about the historical trajectory of some of these systems that are in place. Often there have been historical reasons why certain locations are better endowed with water supply infrastructure, for example, because of our colonial legacies or because of feudal legacies that might have been there. And how do we break away from this? So unless we acknowledge these systems that have been unjust, these systems that are unequal, we will not be able to solve the crisis or address the problem.
You know, I'm quite old, and I remember all the, quite serious fights in the early 2000s over the privatization of water systems, and this debate over what role the state plays as a provider, and how so much water in the global north is publicly provided, and yet in the global south, the answer is the private sector. Could you say a bit about that and what your perspective is on the whole kind of privatization water debate?
I strongly believe that water is a public good and it must be provided through public systems. We have to ensure that our governance systems are in place to provide for that water. Privatizing water is only making water go down the path of where the money is or where the power lies. And in that sense, it's perpetuating the same iniquities and inequalities that has been in the system. The modern state was supposed to ensure that this is a basic service and a basic human right and must be provided for. That said, I do feel that in some cases, I mean, in contexts where as a scarce resource there is a need for some amount of management, so there is a need for certain operational and management costs to be built into it. And so you price the water for those who can pay for it, and therefore let that be a fair pricing mechanism rather than depending on who the private entity is and they decide what the pricing is going to look like. Because in a lot of these countries where water has been privatized, there is a clear linkage with who therefore gets these bids for taking up these, because there's so much money and profits to be made out of the water tariff system, right? So it's important to reflect on that and to how to take that out of the clutches of few individuals or few private entities. So I definitely believe that it has to be managed as a public good.
That I agree with you. Thank you so much for doing that today.
Thank you so much, Sushmita.
Wow, what a great interview. I loved the way she told so many great stories as well to illustrate her point, and particularly that story about the water flowing upwards. I mean, it brings a whole new meaning to trickle down economics, doesn't it? When young children think that, water defies gravity because it flows, strongly in their top floor apartment, but is a trickle down below in the slums.
It was an amazing story, Max. It really says a lot about power and money, no? That it defies even gravity. But as Sushmita was telling these stories, I was also thinking about my own experience in Addis. In my neighborhood, we get water twice a week, and we save or store this water in a tank. And you really have to preserve this. You have to be careful how you use water so that it lasts you throughout the week. And imagine we were better off, we're middle class family. If you live in a poor neighborhood, then it's a huge struggle to get access to water. You have to go to the borehole. You have to queue up since early morning and spend your whole day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's often, of course, the women, the children that go to pick the water. And it's not just the time. The thing that always struck me is the worry, the anxiety. Will there be water there when you get there? What will you do if there isn't water? And when I think of what it's like in a rich country like it is here in London, imagine the panic if you turn the tap on and there wasn't this flow every single day of beautiful, clean water. What an incredible miracle that is, and how the majority of humanity would dream of that kind of thing. So, yeah, it's water is incredibly important, isn't it?
The other thing that came out of the interview is, this huge impact climate change is going to have on water. It's going to make a bad situation much worse. Water will be scarce. Also, in terms of inequality and access to water, things will be really bad. Who's going to be prioritized to get access to that water? When water becomes scarce. But also, Oxfam released a report last year. Oxfam has been working in East Africa for decades. And now they have discovered, because of climate change, when they're digging boreholes to provide access to water to communities, 1 in 5 boreholes they dig now in East Africa ends up drying. Or if there is water, then this water is unfit for humans to drink. So it really shows you that climate is going to make things worse.
Definitely, and it's not just rich people; it's also big companies able to access and take water, dig deeper. So it's really problematic. Another thing that came across for me in relation to the solutions was just how strong Sushmita was about public solutions, collective solutions, government having to get involved in providing clean water for everybody, and how the private sector or private solutions are just not going to work. I thought she was very strong on that one.
Very, Max. And I really believe, if we are to have a chance to address this issue, we really need to have this understanding that we need to have a collective ownership of the basic things in life, whether it's water, access to health, access to food. So on water, who owns this water? Who gets to have access to that water? So if we can address the ownership and and the governance, then I think we can really address issue of access to water.
I think you need to be careful now if you're starting to sound a bit like a socialist.
No comments on that.
Anyway, great interview. Thanks for listening, everybody. Please stay tuned into Equals and watch out for our next episode.
Hope you enjoyed today's episode. We're always keen to hear from our listeners. Do recommend this podcast.
Thank you, everybody. Speak to you next time.
Until next time, thanks, everyone.